I really, let me just begin by pointing out what Scott started with, which is the idea of two systems. Because that's what I'm going to talk about today. But you got to get the basic concept that it's not what you think moves history is not what moves history. And I don't mean you personally. I mean what most people think moves history is not what moves history. Most people, we're talking about this in the car, most people don't think that ideas are real. They don't think that ideas move history. They think that you're foolish. It's almost you're naive if you think that ideas move history. You're an idealist. How pathetic, This is nonsense. It's insane. What's driving these two systems that Scott was developing is a concept of mankind. And let me give you an example on this. I've been telling everyone about this. I think you should tell everyone about this. I think it's fascinating. Prime Minister Modi, right? So I wish I remember the percentage. Do you guys remember what is the percentage of people under the age of 28 in that country? It's humongous. I think it's like 50%.
Yeah, 40-something.
40-something. Between 40 and 50% of the 1.4 billion people in India are my age and under. I turned 28 this year, right? So that is astonishing. And remember that Modi was elected with 530 million people voting in the election. I mean, first of all, that's a great rate of participation. I mean, I don't even know how many eligible voters there are in India, but that's got to be an incredible rate of participation. Meanwhile, what do we average in the United States for presidential elections? I don't even know. It's abysmal. I won't even hazard a guess. Yeah. Anyway, but the point is, okay, so he's got this massive youth operation. His whole country is a youth movement. And he's recruiting people to think of themselves as creative individuals. Which I took a trip to Hyde Park for the 4th of July. I went with the Greenspans. I had a really fantastic time. Saw a few other people. And I had never been to the Franklin Roosevelt Museum. I really urge everyone to go. It's a beautiful thing, and they've actually renovated it recently. But the thing that struck me most was the letters that are written to Roosevelt, and they have hundreds of these letters all up and down the museum. And these are people who write to him, or they write to Eleanor, or they're writing after his death, or they're writing at the beginning of his presidency. And what's clear is that they have a different kind of confidence in themselves because of what he's doing as president. So they're moved by the fact that he's, one of the letters as you walk in the door says something like, you made the president real, as opposed to some far-off person in a building somewhere in Washington, D.C. You made the president a real part of my life. Another person says about the fireside chats, you came into my home and you turned my home into a church. And you were the priest and the radio was the pulpit and my family and I were the parishioners. And I think this really speaks to the concept. It's not some kind of like hero worship. It's not just sort of like veneration of some great man. What it is you uplifted me. Now I can see myself as a human being. And you can imagine how difficult this would be. Imagine that, people are going through this right now, right, in the United States. But imagine going through the Great Depression where your identity is you're a worker, you're a laborer, and you provide for your family. And it's touch and go, because Social Security doesn't exist yet. So anyone who's older, you've got to take care of them, right? Or they must have, at least they have to put aside some money somehow. You've got, hi Giselle. You got people all over who all of a sudden, within 2 years, between 29 and 31, the unemployment rate goes from something like 6, 7, or 8% to 25% in 2 years. So massively, people are losing their jobs, they're losing their identity, right? And Roosevelt comes in and he treats the people like human beings. And the thing that I got most out of this trip, this visit to this museum, was that he actually, the reason he was such a powerful leader was because he believed in the power of the American people. And he committed himself to giving them the self-confidence to see themselves as people who could change history and create a future. So here's my point on Modi, is that Modi, one of the things that he's done that is most stunning is that he has he's made a pledge. He's created a program to build 800 million toilets. And you can imagine the sewer systems that have to be built, the water systems and so forth, if you're going to build 800 million toilets in the next 5 years. Because in 2019 is the 150th anniversary of Mohandas Gandhi's birth. Okay? So 800 million toilets. Why is this so important? Has any,
You know why it's important? Did you see that movie?
I was just going to say that.
Slumdog
Millionaire?
Right.
Does anyone remember this? It won an Oscar?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
The dump heap for the toilet for the whole neighborhood was a huge dump heap with a platform standing over it and a hole in the platform. It's worse than an outhouse, if you can imagine. And this kid fell into it. It's like so much feces, it's unimaginable.
And this is like right into the Ganges River, or wherever else. And so you have terrible diseases. So even kids who do get food, they're malnourished because of the diseases that they have, or parasites, all types of things. Now, the other thing it goes to is the question of the caste system. Because you have going back a system, generations upon generation, that was really massively reinforced by the British in their occupation and their domination of India, that says that you have some people who are very high and some people who are very low, and the people at the bottom are called the untouchables, and they're responsible for sanitation and garbage collection, and that's their hereditary job, like generation after generation. That's what that's your line in life. So in other words, they're treated like slaves. They're treated like subhumans.
Right.
Okay, this is a huge problem in India. It signifies something that is terribly awry in their society. That is just, same evil as slavery in the United States or elsewhere in the world. And this has changed somewhat. That there used to be laws that said that if you were an untouchable, you couldn't marry someone in another caste. You couldn't even eat with someone in another caste. Other laws, you couldn't ride a bicycle through town. It was illegal for an untouchable to do this. And think about the human element of it too, because if you're an untouchable and you're cast into this situation where you grow up in the worst slums in India, in the worst conditions, and you're a garbage collector, or you're a janitor in these, whatever it needs to be done with this terrible situation with the open defecation, then you smell. You're covered in grime for your whole life. You're covered in disease and disgusting things. And how could you possibly see yourself as a human being? You would feel like a beast. You would feel like there's nothing in my life other than just trying to get by. Well, what about your children having a better life? You couldn't have any hope for that because they're one of your caste. And then Modi walks in 2014 and he says, we're going to build modern sanitation and we're going to give everyone the right to see themselves as worthy of a toilet. I find it deeply poignant. I think it goes straight to this question of what is a human being? Because he has a faith in the people, and especially the young people, that they're going to have within them well up all of a sudden a pride, a dignity that had been taken away from them many generations ago. And I just make a further point on this. They could have done this in 1960. They could have done this earlier. I mean, another point Eli was making, he's not here today, but is that plumbing was invented thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. This is not something new. It was invented even thousands of years before the Romans. We got a lot of credit for it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just want you to keep that in mind, because therefore, here's what my class is about today. The discussion that I want to have is about Nicholas of Cusa from the Renaissance and what he did to create the Renaissance, which is based entirely on an idea of man, a new concept of man. And his ideas about what does it mean to be human are what created all of the great breakthroughs in statecraft, all of the great breakthroughs in science, all of the great breakthroughs in culture. And I'm going to counterpose this to what you get from the other side. So I hope that I can provide a really good contrast for you between what our enemy is saying and has been saying for thousands of years and what people who have this idea of, real truthful idea of man believe. Okay, so this is a little bit, if you don't mind, I'm just going to move a little bit closer. Is that okay with you? Okay. All right, so it's going to be a little bit hard to see, but we'll do our best. If you'd like to move up closer, then that's one thing to do too. Okay.
It's better, yeah, I can see.
Easy?
You
All right.
switch it.
You got it, Giselle?
What?
Want to switch?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, this is from 1993. LaRouche was in jail. He was in jail as a political prisoner. And he gave the keynote address to an international conference that we had in 1993, which he recorded from his jail cell. All right? And I found it to be very striking, different from a lot of other things that LaRouche has written or said, spoken. This is the concluding two paragraphs, two ideas. We must see ourselves as individuals, as potentially the embodiment of reason, as imago Dei, in Latin, in the image of God. We must look into the faces of people around the world and see not different races, or this or that distinction, but see in those faces, in those eyes, another human being who is also imago Dei, who has that potential within them, and seek to raise that potential within them, or to create the circumstances in which the ideas of doing good are presented more clearly to the individual, and in which the opportunities for doing that good are more freely provided. If we do that, we are participating in creation. We are of value to mankind as individuals beyond all doubt. So again, in this best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz described it, let evil prompt us not merely to deny evil, which we must do, we must denounce it as well as denying it, but let us be prompted by evil, as Schiller described the principle of tragedy. The tragedy of evil must be attacked, recognized, feared, and hated to such a degree that we are willing to do good finally to supplant the evil. This gets to, Scott's major point, defiance. Most people don't understand the idea of evil. They don't understand the classical conception of what evil really is. So how are you going to understand that Obama is the tool of evil? That he's an evil shithead, right? If you don't understand this, you have to actually hate the evil that he represents. And this has nothing to do with party politics. It doesn't have anything to do with anything like that. It has to do with what it means to be human. So please keep this in mind, because this is my point. This is what I think we should be thinking on. This is what we should be focused on. This is what has real power. Now, let me give you an example. This is a story about Brunelleschi, who famously built the dome at Florence of the Santa Maria del Fiore, right, the beautiful Duomo. He supposedly, he was friends with Donatello, the great sculptor. And supposedly Donatello made this sculpture of the crucifix. And Brunelleschi came in, and he saw, and he looked at Donatello's work, and he said, "You've put a plowsman on the cross. This is too rough. This isn't beautiful enough. This doesn't get it." And so Brunelleschi went and he made his own. And when Donatello walked in to see Brunelleschi's, he was carrying, this is the folk story, he was carrying eggs and meat and bread for lunch or something like this. And he walks in, and as soon as he sees Brunelleschi's Christ, he drops his apron out of shock, and everything falls on the floor. Because he's so struck by the beauty of it. And I think you can see, I know it's difficult since it's not huge, but even from a distance you can see what I'm talking about. And I want to use this to convey that this is something that we're not really going to get at with words. And that's okay. I mean, it's not that that's okay, that's just how it is. So take what you can from this. But you can see, I think, the greater vulnerability of Christ on Brunelleschi's, which is the left. I think you can see it's much more lifelike. It looks, it's rather stunning. It causes me to imagine what is going on as Christ is becoming a man-God. Okay? And I really, I'm going to talk a lot about theology today, so get used to it, But it's anyway, you're going to have to think it through. Imagine that all these many people that were crucified by the Roman Empire, and before them, and what is actually happening. Because in this strikes me as being sort of like a representation, whereas this is like, he is actually supporting all of his weight on that nail at the bottom of through his feet. He's actually suffering. You can see on his face a sublime kind of expression. And Donatello's is certainly beautiful, but it's lacking in that truly divine perspective, that divine spark.
There's no martyrdom in the second on the right. You see it on the left.
There's no what?
Martyrdom.
Martyrdom. I think that's a good way to put it. So, anyway, so I just keep this in mind as a kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. Because it is the divine spark that Cusa develops as a concept that changes history. Human history is understanding that. So, let me sort of go back to Cusa here, because other people may not be too familiar with him, especially if you missed my other class. Nicholas of Cusa is a German cardinal. He's born in 1401. He lives until 1464. So that puts him as roughly contemporary with Brunelleschi. He's about a generation younger, than Brunelleschi. He's the same time as the Medicis. He's when they first become, are pushing create the Platonic Academy in Florence. He's right there at the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. To give you some perspective, right? Dante is in the middle of the 1200s to the late 1200s. And then 1348, the Black Plague hits Florence. And that's when Boccaccio famously writes the Decameron, which is about stories told by people who are living outside of Florence to avoid the Black Plague. And at the same time, you have Petrarch, who's concurrent with Boccaccio in the middle 1300s. And what they're doing is they're starting this concept of mass literacy. They're starting these concepts of retranslating or translating the Greek ancient authors, Plato in particular, Greek playwrights. And they're reacting against the Black Plague, the Dark Ages, the Venetian Empire. Because, in 1348, you have the Black Plague comes in, and I expressed this before, but it's worth saying again. What happens when you have the Black Plague? There's two types of Black Plague. You know this? There's bubonic and there's the pneumonic plague. Okay? Does anyone know why the bubonic plague is called the bubonic plague? Now that we're talking about a terrible situation for humanity. The bubonic plague, you get buboes. B-U-B-O-E-S. A bubo is a terrible tumor, sort of, not a tumor exactly.
Boil,
A boil, yeah, boil. Yeah, boil, right. That quickly appears. And they tend to be like purplish color. And they tend to be in your groin area.
Oh.
And they can be like the size of a small apple. Right? And then if you find out that if you wake up one morning and you have a bubo growing on your leg, you're likely to be dead in a week, maybe 2 weeks. A certain percentage of people survive that. But then there's the pneumonic plague. And the pneumonic plague is, as it sounds like, it's passed by air, right? And so if someone coughs on you and you have the pneumonic plague, then, and you catch it, you could be dead in 48 hours. You could be dead in 24 hours. It's somewhere in that range, and it's extremely deadly. Very few people survive that. So imagine the way this thing goes. The plague is like this, it's like a living thing that sweeps through an urban center and over the course of the summer, and then it's gone. And then it comes back 5 or 10 years later. And this repeats until the early 1400s. So, so imagine the city of Rome. This is worth repeating. People may have heard this from me before, but it's worth going through again. How many people live in metropolitan Rome today? If anyone has a guess. What do you think?
5 million?
4 million. So about 4 million people live there today. How many people live there in 100 AD? 100 AD, after the Roman Empire had begun for about 4 or 5 generations, and actually it's a little bit prior to that too. But before the population collapsed, which did happen in the Roman Empire, at the peak of population in 100 AD, there were 1 million people living in Rome. Huge city. I mean, can you imagine that with no no electricity, nothing like that. But then, like I'm saying, starting around 100 AD, the population starts to blow out because it's an empire, and so therefore it's run by looting and raping and killing, and taxing people to death and everything else. So the population blows out, and then you have the Dark Ages. You have a millennium where empire rules the scene. Just rules the scene, and then you get into the Venetian Empire around the 1200s, 1200s, and then they dominate. And every time that there's a Republican impulse, which of course the most important one from that whole era is Christ, right? But then Charlemagne, and then the various people, obviously Dante in the 1200s, but many others who are fighting for an idea of St. Augustine, of a society that will be good. Despite that, you're in a total collapse mode. Generally, you're in a collapse mode. That's not everywhere in the world. Iraq in 800 AD had 35 million people. By the year 1900, it was down to 5 million people. When you talk about a collapsed society. Anyway, my point is that by the time you get up to Nicholas of Cusa's time, the city of Rome, which was 1 million people, has been reduced to literally 25,000 people. So you can imagine, how many? You'd be walking down the street and everything would be ruins. You would just, there'd be buried buildings everywhere. It'd be like living in the, it's like today, you see all of the science fiction movies are about the apocalypse, post-apocalypse. People walking around in the world after nuclear war. And that's what it would be like. And not to mention, now you get the plague, and so you've got half of your population is dying in the streets. This is simply to say, it was hell. It was hell, it was hell, it was hell. This is the time period of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is murdered. She's this woman of a divine character, absolutely. Young woman, 16 years old, is leading a campaign to create France. And she's burned at the stake. And after they burn her, they open up the funeral, rather the pyre. They open up and they check to make sure she's dead, and then they burn her again. Okay, so this is a time where there's just a Nazi type of evil that dominates. Okay. Despite that, out of this in the 1400s comes miraculous breakthroughs. Cusa is the leader. You won't necessarily read his name in many history books because he's largely been written out of history. And there's some funny stories on that, which I won't be able to go through today, but he's not commonly known. But here's the guy who effectively invented modern science, along with Brunelleschi. Today, I'm going to talk about the key document that he wrote in 1437. No, I'm wrong. Is that right? 1440, excuse me, I'm sorry. 1440, he wrote this piece. It's called De Docta Ignorantia. De Docta Ignorantia, which means on learned ignorance. On learned ignorance. Okay, so that's the topic today. I'm going to go through that. I'll take about another hour, a little bit less than that. But if you want to understand it, you have to understand what came before. That's why I spent all that time on this hellish period before. Was that just an accident? You know, is it just sort of like that's the way that human society is? Is that we go through cyclical collapses? That's what the enemy would have you believe. That's what they want you to think, but it's not. It's intentional destruction of humanity. And it comes down to the idea of two different ideas of man, two systems. The one system is Plato's system, Plato's concept of man. And here's Plato, right? And the other one is Aristotle. Those are the two basic battles. That's the basic battle that we're still dealing with today. Aristotle, the Aristotelian system, is today's Wall Street system. It's the British Empire today. Plato's system is LaRouche's system. It's LaRouche's concept of man. Okay, so if you want to understand Aristotle and Plato, start from this. Don't give the guy any credit, all right? He is an evil bastard. Aristotle, I know this may shock you, right? Because you go to school, you go to university, people talk about Aristotle. He's often called the philosopher. He's given all of this accolades and so forth. But this is because our society has become corrupted by Aristotelianism. If you went to Harvard University in 1635 or something, whatever, within the first generation of its founding, you would have studied Plato and Kepler. You would have studied, you probably would have come across Cusa. You would have studied not Leibniz yet, excuse me. But anyway, you would have studied Plato and Kepler in particular. All right? That's what they were working on. But we've been corrupted. And so it's important to understand how Aristotle corrupted Greece. I'm not an expert on this, but I am capable of telling the story. Basically, Plato, his dialogues span a whole period in which Athenian society is collapsing. And first, Athens is making these tremendous military victories against the Persian Empire, right? Like the battle at Marathon. These incredible situations where they win despite having a tiny number of people against these hordes of Persians because of their breakthroughs in military science, because of what they're doing, you know, tactically, strategically. So Athens is doing fantastic. This Athenian Republic, they're breaking out. They threaten the oligarchical system of the day, which is the Persian Empire. And the Persians, realizing that they can't defeat Athens militarily, they go at them from the inside out. Like what Abraham Lincoln said, the only way you can ever destroy this country is, you know, from corrupting us from the inside out. And so that's what they did. Plato documented the destruction of truth from the Eleatic school to the Sophists. And these are people like in the famous Parmenides dialogue. Parmenides he's of the Eleatic school, Eleatic. He says, truth exists, but you can never understand it. Truth exists, but don't even try, you never forget it. It's something that is completely untouchable by man. You can't even strive to figure it out. Because truth by its nature is something that you can't ever get close to figuring out. That's a major corruption. The Sophists come after, and they're the ones who say, you have your truth, I have my truth, you know, we all have our own truth. It's the same thing as today's, you know, cultural relativists, or whatever, the liberalism, British liberalism, same basic concept. Okay, so Aristotle comes in 350 BC. And Plato has opposed this destruction of society for his whole lifetime. And then Aristotle comes in when Plato's an old guy. And let me not say anything that I'm not 100% sure on. But anyway, he comes in and Aristotle comes in and he corrupts the Platonic Academy. And Aristotle was a fink. I mean, this guy, he's the one who assassinated Alexander the Great. He assassinated Alexander the Great. We have all of this stuff is on our website. You should read it. And then he starts putting forth these moronic ideas, these outrageous ideas that are just forced on people. Let me go through them. This is from a book that Aristotle wrote called Posterior Analytics. Which I think is really funny. Because that's exactly what it is. He's examining someone's rear end, his own rear end, I guess. And he says, we have already said that scientific knowledge through demonstration is impossible unless a man know the primary immediate premises. How does man know? We must possess a capacity of some sort, which is at least an obvious characteristic of all animals, for they possess a congenital discriminative capacity, which is called sense perception. Okay, so we must be like that. So our sense perception comes to be what we call memory, and out of frequently repeated memories of the same things develops experience, for a number of memories constitute a single experience. From experience again originates the skill of the craftsman and the knowledge of the man of science. So this is Aristotle's conception of how you come to know something, is through sense perception, through repeated experiences of sense perception. That everything comes as though you were an animal, and that's how you come to know things. Let that sink in. You know, consider that. What he's saying about you. And whether you think that that's true, that the only way that you know something is from what you sense, what has already passed before you, what you've already, you know, taken in that way. Here he says something similar and related. Since according to common agreement, there is nothing outside and separate in existence from sensible spatial magnitudes, the objects of thought are all in sensible forms, both abstract objects and all the states and affections of sensible things. Hence, no one can learn or understand anything in the absence of senses. And when the mind is actively aware of anything, it is necessarily aware of it along with an image, for images are like sensuous contents. While in respect to all the other senses, we fall below many species of animals. In respect to touch, we far excel all other species in exactness of discrimination. That is why man is the most intelligent of animals, because we have the most developed sense of touch. That's what he claims. So you can imagine what he thinks knowledge is. Carnal knowledge, I imagine. And and this is what he's trying to get people to believe. The only way you can know something is if you can touch it and feel it and see it for yourself. That's the only way you can know anything. You might ask yourself what this immediately excludes. How about a soul?
And how about God?
God, absolutely. Just consider it. How about think about the question of Einstein. People know that his great discoveries in relativity were made with thought experiments, right? Where he was experimenting with his mind. He wasn't actually writing on a beam of light. You didn't have to write on the beam of light in order to have the sense perception and observe what was happening. It happened in his mind. That's where discovery happens. How about a mind? There's another way to put it. Mind. Where does your mind exist? Your mind is not the same thing as your brain, because, your brain, anyway, it's not the same, right? Does everyone get that? The difference between a mind and a brain? So, okay. So I hope you're getting a sense of this. What I'm trying to get you to decide upon is to see that this is evil. It's not something that's just sort of like misguided. It's something that's intentionally a way of socially programming people. That's ultimately what this is about. And let me give you some more evidence of that.
So he's kind of saying like, you're too stupid to take care of yourself, so let's let the Caesars do it. Whoever the Caesars in the Senate say you need to do this, you need to do because you don't have enough intelligence. You're not.
I think that's an implication of what he's saying here. Because
we're like an animal, so we have to guide. We need guidance from height and
Aristotle famously is the one who coins the idea of the blank slate. That your mind is a blank slate. Or that where you write, things are written down on it. And so in his world, like you're expressing here, whoever's got the most written down on their slate must be the smartest person, and therefore they should be in charge.
Yeah, it's just Giselle has it right, but it's more than that. It's just a matter of control. Control.
Yeah. It's all justification of something that already exists, which is the will of a Zeus or a Satan to dominate everyone else and treat everyone else as slaves. It's all just a justification. You'll see that. That's another way of saying what I'm trying to say. It's a fraud. It's not like Aristotle is actually trying to figure out how the world works. Don't give him so much credit. He's trying to create a system of knowledge that accords with what he's already decided, which is that some people should live like cattle. I'm going to come back through. I'm going to actually do this a little bit differently from how I did it before. I'm going to go through all of Aristotle for right now, and then we're going to come back and work through Cusa. This is from Politics. So you can see that some of our people in DC have been reading this. The slave is a living possession and property, an instrument. The master is only the master of the slave. He does not belong to him. Whereas the slave is not only the slave of his master, but wholly belongs to him. For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary, but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjugation, others for rule. You notice that he doesn't explain why it's necessary or expedient. He may somewhere else in this piece, I don't know. But reading Aristotle is very painful. I try not to do it. Anyway, but you notice how this works, right? So he just asserts this. It's just necessary for there to be slaves. Why? Well, because it's necessary.
You're seeing this for the first time, because I never really got it.
Yeah.
Aristotle stuff. I'm amazed that they actually have this crap in the college courses.
I know!
How can they even study this crap?
I'm astonished. I don't know. I feel the same way about Nietzsche. I mean, when you actually read it, it's just like obvious that whoever's teaching this stuff didn't actually read it, or they do, or at least if they did believe it, then they're such weak-minded individuals that they don't give a damn about truth. They're just what Schiller would term bread scholars. They're just doing scholarly work for their bread, for their
Maybe
own income.
People, if they were being taught this stuff, they said, okay, you guys, and kind of teaching on the first part, you're the ones who are going to be the rulers.
Well, I think.
Everybody else is going to be subjugated.
Well, let me give you an example. I think that's getting towards it. Let me say it a little bit more clearly. Either you're fooled by Aristotle and you genuinely think, wow, he's right, which means that you were really stupid, unfortunately, or you actually are writing the same kind of thing and you agree with him because you are trying to do the same thing as he was, because you think that you should rule, if you see what I'm saying. So how do you dupe a huge number of people? I mean, this is the question we should be asking ourselves today, because that's what's happening in our society today. There are these big lies, these Goebbels lies that huge numbers of people accept without ever even considering whether it's true or not. It's it's mind-boggling, right? So why is that happening? Well, you know what happened before the Renaissance? Because the Renaissance was a big fight for, a lot of it was a fight for translation of Plato, translation of Euripides, translation of everything that we could possibly get our hands on from the ancient Athenians. But before that project, which really didn't begin in earnest until the early 1400s, before that project, the Venetians had their own project of translation. Hey guys. And their translation began at the first universities. Okay? Does anyone know what the first university in all of Europe was?
You had this last one, the University of Bologna.
Thank you. Yes. Some people weren't there, Howard. I won't retread too much. But the University of Bologna was I guess founded in 1084, and they started translating Aristotle. And so Aristotle was translated into Latin and far more available than any of Plato. So the university system was created by the empire. Not that I'm not saying universities are bad. I'm saying, but the first ones were, and this kind of concept of scholarship and so forth, of knowing of science and so forth, was dominated by people who were intentionally pushing this down their throats. Okay, so let me just continue. This is a separate part. It doesn't actually follow. Then, asks Aristotle, ought the good to rule and have supreme power? Should the best man rule? No. The principle to be maintained is that the multitude ought to be supreme rather than the few best. For the many, of whom each individual is but an ordinary person, when they meet together, may very likely be better than the few good, if regarded not individually but collectively. For some understand one part, and some another, and among them they understand the whole. There's another word for that. Mob rule, right? Democracy. This is Andrew Jackson style democracy. And everyone knows who really runs. But I mean, let's imagine this is stupidity. Should the good rule and have supreme power? Should the good be in charge? No. I mean, it's this lays it bare that you're not dealing with someone who's trying to figure out the mysteries of the universe. Here's more from the study of Rearians. All instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds from pre-existing knowledge. The mathematical sciences and all other speculative disciplines are acquired in this way, and so are the two forms of dialectical reasoning, syllogistic and inductive. For each of these latter makes use of old knowledge to impart new. Old knowledge to impart new. The syllogism, by assuming an audience that accepts its premises. Induction, by exhibiting the universal, is implicit in a clearly known particular. Okay, so what is a syllogism? People are familiar with this, I'm sure. All B is A, all C is B, therefore, all C is A. This is a syllogism. This is Aristotle's method of, truth-seeking, of argumentation, of whatever he wants to call it. The ludicrous thing is that a syllogism, the middle term, is denoted as the cause. So think about the way this is constructed. This one I think is more better. All birds fly. Hawks are birds. Therefore, hawks fly. So if you were to ask me, and I were an Aristotelian and I'm using syllogisms, why do birds fly? Or no, why do hawks fly? Why do hawks fly?
Because they're birds.
Because they're birds. Hawks fly because they're birds.
That's what you call a circular argument, isn't it?
Exactly. That's exactly the point. It's turned into a system of premises, which are just sort of axioms that you accept. Just sort of laws that you accept. Just like he said prior, he said, some people have to be in charge, have to be masters, and some people have to be slaves. It's necessary and expedient. Why? Because it's necessary. Because we need it. That's using this kind of logic. He just defines something and then expects you to accept it just because he's presenting it. Does that follow, Giselle? So this is the key method of of Aristotelian investigation. There's an excellent Fidelio from '92 that has this is a publication we used to put out in the '90s. It has an article from a woman named Elizabeth Hellenbroy, where I took a lot of my Aristotle material from. Okay, so now we're going to go to the other side of things. So I'll return here for a moment. I think it's pretty conclusive right there, what we're dealing with. The question, and remember, this dominates for 1,700 years, Aristotelian thinking, from 350 BC to 1400, give or take. So that is empire. That's really empire. That's what we're dealing with today. Why, Argentina has to pay their debts. Why? Because they owe their debts. Because, for what benefit? For what good? What good will be achieved with this? The good is gone. The concept of, like we were saying, the mind or God or the good, whatever you're thinking of, it's just out the window.
Or we know that Vladimir Putin is an evil warmonger, therefore everything follows from that.
Yeah, right. Putin's evil. This and that and the other. Therefore, we should go to war with Russia. And okay. So what's the alternative? How does Cusa, one man, deign to overturn this? He's got a tremendous boldness. The document that we're going to be talking about. He describes in the opening paragraph, so it came to him in a vision from the Father of Lights, as he says, as he was on as I mentioned before, as he was on a boat coming from Constantinople back to Venice, actually, and then to Florence. where he was, and on this boat he was bringing the emperor of the Byzantine emperor and the leaders of the Orthodox Church with him, because he had convinced them to join with him to go to the Council of Florence, what became the Council of Florence, to reunite the Eastern and Western churches. This is like a totally astonishing political breakthrough. The Eastern and Western churches had been separate for 400 years, and they had been separating in terms of their ideology for more like, 600 or 800 years. And he got them to come together, and he said, "You've got to listen to me on the idea of the filioque, which means and the Son." So anyone who grew up Catholic can remember, the question is, where does the Holy Spirit come from? From the Father and the Son. Okay? Whereas the Orthodox would say, it comes from the Father. The Holy Spirit comes from the Father, which the implication, very, very clear, is that Christ was not a man-God. He was not divine. He did not share in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit did not flow from him, according to the Orthodox. And that has major implications about what you think about mankind, because that means you don't think that a person can be godlike, can be godlike. Which means that, anyway, let me leave it at that for now. Roll that over in your head. Return to what I started out with this hellish situation. And then put yourself in the mind of someone who's just trying to figure it out. Someone who influenced Cusa a lot was a guy named St. Anselm, who was, I think, about a century beforehand. And he writes a book called Proslogion, and it is a proof of the existence of God. I'm not going to go through the proof, but you should read it. It's not at all difficult to read. Let me give you the example. I want to read the first chapter to give you an idea of, put your mind in the proper frame of mind. Put yourself in the shoes of someone coming out of this hell who just wants to know, what is truth? How do I know what I know? Where is God in this world of pain and destruction? Chapter 1, arousal of the mind for contemplating God. So that's what we're trying to do. Come now, insignificant man. Leave behind for a time your preoccupations. Seclude yourself for a while from your disquieting thoughts. Turn aside now from heavy cares and set aside your wearisome tasks. Make time for God and rest a while in Him. Enter into the inner chamber of your mind. Shut out everything except God and what is of aid to you in seeking Him. After closing the chamber door, seek Him out. Speak now, my whole heart. Speak now to God. I seek your countenance. Your countenance, O Lord, do I seek. So come now, Lord my God. Teach my heart where and how to seek you, where and how to find you. If you are not here, O Lord, where shall I seek you who are absent? But if you are everywhere, why do I not behold you as present? But surely you dwell in light inaccessible. Yet where is light inaccessible? Or how shall I approach unto light inaccessible? Or who will lead me to and into this light so that in it I may behold you? Furthermore, by what signs, by what facial appearance shall I seek you? Never have I seen you, O Lord my God. I am not acquainted with your face. What shall this, your distant exile, do? What shall he do, O most exalted Lord? What shall your servant do, anguished out of love for you, and cast far away from your face? He pants to see you, but your face is too far removed from him. He desires to approach you, but your dwelling place is inaccessible. He desires to find you, but does not know your abode. He longs to seek you, but does not know your countenance, O Lord. You are my God, and you are my Lord, yet I have never seen you, and never have I seen you. You have created me, and created me anew, and have bestowed upon me whatever goods I have, but I am not yet acquainted with you. Indeed, I was made for seeing you, but not yet have I done that for which I was made. I think this is real beautiful. I think this is an expression of this deep desire to figure out how to know the good. How do you know anything? How can you, I mean, he's dealing with all these paradoxes. God is everywhere, but he's nowhere. How can I look for God if I don't know what he looks like? These are the questions that Cusa in De Docta actually resolves. He creates a method for seeking truth, for seeking a higher knowledge. And it works. That's the key thing here. And it's successful. But try to put yourself in this frame of mind. Cusa writes his De Docta Ignorantia in 1440. Then it's attacked in 1444 by a guy in Heidelberg. And so in 1449, Cusa writes Apology for De Docta Ignorantia. In other words, a rebuttal. And here's what he says. Because the funny thing is the guy, his name is Wenck, he accuses Cusa of this. He basically says, this guy doesn't even care about Aristotle. He's disrespecting Aristotle. And Cusa says basically, yeah, you got it. He says, nowadays the Aristotelian tendency dominates, which finds the coincidence of opposites, which one has to acknowledge to find the ascent toward mystical theology to be a heresy. To those trained in this school, this approach seems to be completely nonsensical. They refuse it as something completely opposite to their intentions. Therefore, it would be close to a miracle, as well as it would be a complete transformation of the school if they were to abandon Aristotle and reach a higher level. The key concept that we're going to talk about, and I'm trying to develop, and I'm going to develop, is the coincidence of opposites. How are you going to deal with these paradoxes? God is everywhere, but he's nowhere. You have to be able to think not just in a Aristotelian, logical, moving little puzzle pieces around kind of a way. You've got to put yourself in that frame of mind that Anselm was in. You've got to lock out everything else. You've got to lock out all sense perception, really, and think in a purely intellectual way, in a way that ascends unto God. Which is completely contrary to Aristotle, who said earlier, the only thing you can know is sense perception. And these guys are saying the only way you can know God is to ignore sense perception. But the key in this is the coincidence of opposites, and that's what we want to work through here. So Cusa has a very unique way of expressing himself. And before I begin here, what I want to urge you to do is to intend yourself to read this document, De Docta Ignorantia. So just think about that. He talks in book 1, it's a 3-book document. He talks in book, I guess it's about 100 pages, a little less than that. He talks in book 1 about the nature of the universe as within the nature of God. Really, book 1 it's about the absolute maximum. It's about God. Book 2 is specifically about the universe, the created universe. Book 3 is about Christ. It's about man, the man God, human creativity. Okay, so book 1 he lays out how you're going to be thinking about things. He says, I've struck upon a method called learned ignorance, a way that you can understand the incomprehensible incomprehensibly. A way that you can think about paradoxes, that you can find truth through paradox. It's one way of thinking about it. This is one of the key ideas that he presents. It's about how are you going to understand truth? Because remember, I was talking about Aristotle, and before then the Eleatics and the Sophists, and what they said about truth. So here's what Cusa says about the nature of truth. Therefore, it is not the case that by means of likenesses, a finite intellect can precisely attain the truth about things. For truth is not something more or less, but is something indivisible. Whatever is not truth cannot measure truth precisely. By comparison, a non-circle cannot measure a circle, whose being is something indivisible. Hence, the intellect, which is not truth, never comprehends truth so precisely that truth cannot be comprehended infinitely more precisely. For the intellect is the truth, as an inscribed polygon is to the inscribing circle. The more angles the inscribed polygon has, the more similar it is to the circle. However, even if the number of its angles is increased ad infinitum, the polygon never becomes equal to the circle unless it is resolved into an identity with the circle. Hence, regarding truth, it is evident that we do not know anything other than the following, namely, that we know truth not to be precisely comprehensible as it is. So, let me pause there and draw that for you. Let's see, I hope we have a pen. Do we have a marker back there? You think we have one, Art? Okay, they have one in another. Yeah, if you want to ask. That'd be great. But if you pause for a moment and try to think this over, and imagine a way that I've tried to think about it is, what does it mean to measure? What does it mean to know something? I mean, that's really what he's dealing with. In another dialogue, he says, I think that the word measure comes from the word mens, meaning mind. So how do you know something? Thank you. How do you measure truth? And here's my best, oh, this isn't working. So, but think about like when you first learned to measure in first grade. I used to teach first grade, so I remember teaching kids this. You take a ruler and you compare it to something. And when it's equal, when two things are equal, then you've measured it, right? That's how you know that things. That's how you can measure something. Because you know the one thing is equal to 1 inch, 1.5 inches, 2.9 yards, 145 miles, whatever. But truth is something that is infinite. So can you ever put something finite, like something from your mind? Because your mind isn't infinite. So, your mind is finite. Only God's mind is infinite, right? So, okay, how about the world? The universe is not, nothing in the universe is infinite. Because it's in the universe, so it has to be finite. Otherwise it would be infinite, it would have no beginning and no end. So it could never have been created. Could never have come into existence. So infinite things do not exist in the universe. How can you compare, how can you measure something that's infinite then? Because that's what we're trying to do. Remember what we're trying to find God's face. In other words, you're trying to figure out the nature of the infinite. But you have nothing that you can hold up. You don't have an infinite ruler that you can hold up to God to see exactly what he is. So that's the idea. And he says, think about truth as a circle. Think about God, think about the absolute as a circle, which by its nature is completely different from the polygon that you might inscribe within it. So you put a triangle within the circle, right? And that polygon, as you add more sides to it, it becomes, a square, then a pentagon, and then it becomes more and more many-sided. And you're going to get closer and closer to that circle. Because the more sides that you get, the more area you take up within the circle. If people can follow me on this. But even if you have, say you had a polygon with 64 sides. If you can imagine. It would be really close in its shape to a circle. And then you make twice as many sides. And it's going to be even closer because the sides are going to be tiny and there's going to be tons and tons and tons of them. But no matter what, you're never going to reach a circle. If it's a polygon by its nature, it has many sides. That's what the word means. A circle only has one. So you can never reach the circle by means of a polygon. And our mind is like the polygon, and truth is like the circle, or God is like the circle. You can never match up. Oh, good. Great. Oh.
Good thinking.
All right. 3 cheers for Scott.
Fred will be pleasantly surprised.
All right. So here's what I'm saying. You start with, triangle. Or let's say, this looks better as a square anyway. A square. All right. And then, so then you have a certain approximation of what truth looks like. But then you can get a little bit better idea of truth with pentagon. Because you're a little bit closer to a circle with a pentagon. And then you keep going and add more and more sides so that eventually you have a many-sided polygon. And compared to the other polygons, this one only leaves a tiny amount of difference. It's very close to the circle. And you can imagine if I kept doing this and I split every one of these sides in half, and I kept doing that, and I kept doing that, and I kept doing that, then eventually you would have a figure, a polygon within, that if you did a zoom up, let's see, something like that, right? But no matter what, you would never get to the circle. You would never go into identity with the circle. So you could never measure the circle, because we just established that the idea of measurement is you have something that is equal to.
Well, not by that method.
Well, precisely. It's a metaphor. I'm not actually trying to do it, right? It's a metaphor. So you can never, if you were just adding sides infinitely, you would never become a circle. You'd never get the circle. And this is a key concept. What he's saying is that's what the mind is like relative to God's mind. Relative to truth. So truth is incomprehensible. Truth is like a circle. You're never going to touch the truth. You're never going to hold the truth in your mind because your mind isn't infinite and truth is infinite by its nature. This is a very different idea from Aristotle, right? This is a very different concept because it means that you can come to know closer and closer and closer what the truth is. You can get more and more and more. Your polygon can become more and more like the circle, but you're never going to actually become it. Okay, so can you unmute it?
Well, isn't it also true, or maybe if you think about this, that even the act of trying to get there is totally different from the Aristotle view?
Yeah.
Even trying to make it so that you're getting closer and closer to the truth, or the exact truth of the circle,
Yeah.
in other words, is an exercise in using your mind, human exercise.
Let's continue to the question of what that method is.
Yeah.
What is the method of seeking the truth that he's talking about here? What do we have access to? This is the concept, again, of the coincidence of opposites. I haven't even expressed it yet, but let me do it now. Okay. Since I am going to discuss the maximum learning of ignorance, and by learning of ignorance he means because you're never going to know truth comprehensively, it's knowledge for you to know that you're never going to learn it. It's a kind of a learned ignorance. You know that you are ignorant as a human being of the truth by nature. of the truth itself. So you have to know, you have to know, we're all set, Fred, thank you. We found something to cover. Appreciate it. Hold on to it.
Hold on to them.
Yeah. We can use lots of different colors. Okay, I must deal with the nature of maximality. So let it sink into your mind what it means by maximality. The nature of the maximum, the quality of the maximum. By the maximum, with the capital M, you might also say God. Now I give the name maximum to that than which there cannot be anything greater. Fullness befits what is one. Thus, oneness, which is also being, coincides with maximality. But if such oneness is altogether free from all relation and contraction, obviously nothing can be opposed to it, since it is absolute maximality. Thus, the maximum is the absolute one, which is all things. And all things are in the maximum, for it is the maximum. And since nothing is opposed to it, the minimum likewise coincides with it, and hence the maximum is also in all things. Let me go back to this here. Let's just stick on this idea. The maximum befits oneness. It's the one, you might say. All of everything, that which there can be nothing greater, is a one. It's a unity. But such oneness is altogether free from all relation and contraction, meaning nothing is opposed to it, since it is absolute maximality. So here's the real difficult trick. Take your idea of oneness and think of an absolute oneness to which there's no opposition. Normally we think of one as opposed to two. Imagine a oneness to which there is no opposition. He's trying to take you into those types of paradoxes that the mind almost doesn't want to go to. It's really difficult to think these things through. But he's saying you have to think about these things from that standpoint if you want to understand God. So the maximum to which there is nothing opposed, absolute one, which is all things. So the maximum is nothing opposed to it, so therefore it's also the minimum. Normally we think of a maximum and a minimum. But in the absolute maximum, there's no separation. You think about the oneness, one. We think about one as the smallest number. But in this case, we're talking about a one that is the largest. So it's the largest and the smallest at the same time. You have to do a little bit of gymnastics on this. Are you following me, Antimon? Yeah? Okay. So, because it is absolute, it is every possible being. It contracts nothing from things, all of which derive from it. In this first book, I shall strive to investigate incomprehensibly above human reason this maximum, which the faith of all nations indubitably believes to be God. I shall investigate with the guidance of him who alone dwells in inaccessible light. Okay, so if you let that sink in for a second, and this idea, I think it's very powerful, this concept of the oneness to which nothing is opposed, to which two is not opposed. This is destroying Aristotle. Because how could you have one that is above your concept of one? How could you have an absolute one in Aristotle's universe? How could you have something where the maximum and the minimum are the same? That's what's called the coincidence of opposites, when they come together in a higher principle.
Daniel, I don't know if I'm just throwing this out there as a means of kind of what I'm thinking of.
Go ahead.
It's more, I guess, as opposed to kind of the theory and definitions and things like that, maybe in a sense of the physical universe. Now we're still using the materials that I'm sure Aristotle and others would use, but if you think of sets, for example, like for instance, everything is a subset of the comprehensive set, which is truth. So even a null set is existent within that comprehensive set, which would be the minimum, which would be nothing along with everything else. So you can have that comprehensive set where you can take a zillion, 100 billion other things, but that 100 billion other things are subsumed within that comprehensive set.
I think it's somewhat different. Okay, so you're thinking about the infinite. Everything that's finite has a beginning and an end, right? But the infinite doesn't. So the infinite occurs before anything that's created. But the infinite also it occurs before time. So how could you have a before time? Those are the kind of paradoxes that he's trying to get you to think about. How could you have a before time? So when we're talking about something that exists before time, we really mean not like the minute before, we mean like prior to. Something that is prior to. Because it is the cause of things. Maybe this will make it more clear. When we're talking about seeking God, we're talking about trying to figure out the cause of things. Go back to Aristotle. Aristotle says a hawk can fly because it's a bird. Cusa says, what are you doing trying to figure out the cause of things from these, from created things, from your made up reasons? The cause of things is the divine. And you're only going to understand the divine if you can conceive of this type of coincidence of opposites. Of a universe where before whatever nonsense Aristotle created. Let me see if I can use an example to make this more clear.
There's no ruler or rule.
Right. Well, explain that. I mean,
Well, I don't know if I can explain exactly, but it encompasses both in one.
Right. Right. Well, you can think in terms of, see, it's funny how it goes. You're thinking there's no thing about ruler like a ruler that you measure things with, but of course it goes with the social system. And another way to think about the coincidence of opposites. Lincoln says, neither a master nor a slave. All of Aristotelian society, all of society up until the Renaissance, all conceptions of statecraft are based on the idea of someone who's in charge and other people who belong to him or her. And then with modern statecraft, Cusa creates this. He writes a book called The Catholic Concordance. It's about the consent of the governed. It's about the commonwealth. It's about the general welfare. It's all the concepts that are inherent to the Declaration of Independence. Cusa is the first person to talk about them. This guy, and he's extremely political. He writes these at the major councils of Europe, of the Catholic Church. He's famous in his day. At the second most famous council, other than the Council of Florence, the Council of Basel, he writes a piece that's all about statecraft, about how to found a nation state for the benefit of the common welfare. Because he rejects the rules that had come before. You're either a master or a slave. And like Lincoln, he says, neither a master nor a slave, but something higher. We can ascend from these bestial conceptions to something that is more like God. That's what this kind of thinking is trying to get you to do. I want to do a couple more things and then just make it open it up. This is difficult stuff, and I would urge you to read it. Let me try to get your mind, again, like that guy, St. Anselm, who's trying to figure out, he's desperately trying to find God. Now, imagine most people were trying to find God in the 1300s. You know what they're doing? They're in cults. Because they're desperate. They think the plague is a punishment from God. And you have these cult leaders who are going around saying, it's a punishment from God, therefore we have to do this. Therefore we have to do that. God says this, God says that. And St. Anselm is saying, well, how do you know what God's saying? How do you know what God is doing? How do you know what God's face looks like? I don't know. How do we figure this stuff out? How do we know what the good is? How do we do good? That's the question that's burning in his heart and his soul. It means you have to leave aside the sense perception. You have to look for the paradoxes, the coincidence of opposites, the places where what you thought were completely separate ideas actually have the same cause. Because if you can think about real physical cause, then you can understand what's really going on. Imagine the question between the curved and the straight. For our purposes, say that the bigger circles are of a greater curvature. Well, think about it as an idea in motion. These are circles. Imagine that these extend to circles. Okay. As you become smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually you're going to have a straight line like this. If those lines collapse onto themselves. In the other direction, the bigger a circle is, we're going to say it's more and more curved. What is the maximum curvature, the maximum circle? It's straight. If you can conceive of that again, these circles are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're going towards a maximum circle. This is the smallest circle. This is a larger circle. This is an even larger circle. We're headed towards the biggest circle. When you finally get to the maximum circle, maximum curvature is a straight line. I'm not talking about, you're not going to do this on your graph paper. I'm talking about in your intellect, if you can conceive of an infinite circle. It is an infinite.
Increasing the radius till.
Yeah, there we go.
Radius becomes longer and longer. It becomes an infinite radius.
So it becomes an infinite radius. It'll coincide with an infinite line. You might think of this. Think of this like like lines on a globe. The largest circle on the globe, like the equator or something. When you look at it, it's a straight line. How do I put this better?
Well, it's the same thing like this room. Like if you look at this room as part of a circle of the earth.
Yeah.
You cut up the earth and then going down to the middle of the earth.
Yeah.
So this could be part of a circle from that door to that window. A circle going around the earth.
Sure.
With the center in the middle of the earth.
Let's see. Go ahead, Rick. What do you think?
So consider a sphere that's sitting on a flat plane.
Okay.
Take a point at the North Pole, remove it. Now consider ways that you can project, and you could represent every point on the sphere by taking a straight line from the North Pole through that particular point on the sphere and extending it until it hits the flat plane. The North Pole will not be represented because as you project those lines throughout, you will hit every point on the plane.
Yeah.
But you will not have the North Pole represented. You complete the picture by adding what we call the point at infinity, which is the North Pole.
Rick used to teach math. Just in case anyone doesn't know.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it might be. Yeah, something like that.
Just
Visually.
completing the whole thing with the point of infinity. It's not actually represented.
I follow
Otherwise,
you.
you're not going to get a straight line from just a single point. The closer you get to trying to represent the North Pole, further to infinity you get, but you never hit it.
The point that I'm trying to make here, if I confused you, let it go a little bit. The point that's helpful, Rick. But the point that I'm trying to make here is think about it from another perspective. And if you're thinking about, he writes about it here. Let's see. Here we go. Maximum equality, which is neither other than nor different from anything, surpasses all understanding. Since absolutely maximum, the absolutely maximum is all that which can be, it is altogether actual. Just as there cannot be a greater, so for the same reason there cannot be a lesser. Since it is all. Can't be greater, can't be lesser, it's everything. But the minimum is that than which there cannot be a lesser. And since the maximum is also such, it is evident that the minimum coincides with the maximum. When you're talking about the absolute of everything, again, this is the concept of a one to which two is not opposed. Then maximum and minimum coincide. The foregoing point will become clearer to you if you contract maximum and minimum to quantity. For maximum quantity is maximally large, and minimum quantity is maximally small. So, and that minimum is a maximum, because it's the maximally tiny. Therefore, if you free maximum and minimum from quantity by mentally removing large and small, you will see clearly that maximum and minimum coincide. For maximum is a superlative, just as minimum is a superlative. They're both the maximum of what they are. The maximum smallest thing, the most smallest thing, right? The very, very most smallest thing, and the very, very most largest thing are the same in that sense, and that they're the very, very, very most of what they are. Therefore, it is not the case that absolute quantity is maximum quantity rather than minimum quantity. In it, the minimum is the maximum coinciding. So let me get off this at this moment. I want you to think about this. There's more to go through. But let me return to the sort of more poetic point, okay, rather than trying to hammer at this. Let me try to go back to the question of the Christs, the two Christs, Brunelleschi and Donatello, to get at this idea of the coincidence of opposites and why it overthrows Aristotle. Let me make that the central point of what we're doing. This is an image of Dürer, the great artist of Nuremberg, who comes about, he's born something like 10 years after Cusa lives. This is the oldest, well, let me put it this way. This is the youngest self-portrait that we know of from that period. And up until this point, in other words, up until this point, it's from like probably 1480, 1485, something like that. He is 13 years old, and he drew himself. So you have this sort of like awakening of a concept of the self, that is coming here. This is a portrait from when, actually I think he's 28 here. So he would be in Modi's India. And does anyone know what this portrait signifies? This is Dürer as a young man. Does anyone know, if you were to see this in 15, exactly. It's a portrait of the artist as Christ. And you can tell that by his pose, by the way that he's looking out. This is a pose and a sort of a perspective that is reserved for Christ. The way that he's holding his hands. It would be very explicit to someone in the 14 or 1500s. And I think if you look at it, you can see that, right?
Was it controversial?
Yes. Think about the idea of the coincidence of opposites. Supposedly man and God are opposite. In Christ and in this self-conception of man, they are unified. When man is fighting to do the good, he ascends unto godliness. Because godliness, God does good, right? So man can do God's work. Man is a co-creator. And that is a huge shift from man is a beast, man is a master or a slave.
And so who was it Cusa's concept that Imago Dei?
Yes.
Okay, so
It's not, he wasn't the first person to say this, but he develops it from the standpoint of the coincidence of opposites. How can you conceive of these two opposites? And he says they're not. They coincide in a higher way. They're actually the same considered from the standpoint of God. It's kind of like imagining, and what he's trying to do is get you to put yourself as though you were God. Think about truth. That is the method of Kepler. Kepler discovers the universe, the solar system, by putting himself as though he were God. He imagines, well, if I were God, how would I construct the universe? And he goes through all of these different investigations of how shapes work, how geometry works, how constructive geometry works, how do harmonies work. And he comes to, he discovers by placing himself in that position as though he were the architect of the universe. That's how he discovers the universe, how the universe works, the system of the universe. No one would have done that beforehand. Beforehand, science, it's a huge revolution. Because under Aristotle, science is just memorizing facts. Science is just accepting.
Like the British said, Newton was.
What's that?
The British said Newton was one discoverer.
Yeah, like Newton, for example. Newton is a plagiarist and no good. But under Aristotle, there's no concept of creative discovery coming from man's mind. The mind doesn't exist. Because the only thing that exists is sense perceptual things, and the mind doesn't exist in sense perception. An identity of being one with Christ, it doesn't exist under Aristotle. He's by nature, he's satanic. That's the point that I want to bring to bear on this. Because the polemical point I'm trying to make here, which I hope comes through with this, I think this is probably the best example of it, is that whether you realize it or not, you're living in a society that since about 1900 has been rapidly disintegrating in terms of the question of how to know something. This answers why you might ask yourself, why don't people understand that these lies are lies? Why is it when I call people up on the phone, they don't know what's going on? It's because they don't know how to think, and inherently they have a slave-like mentality because they've accepted this nonsense like Aristotle that is treating them as a slave, and they have decided it's not my place to see myself as in the image of God. I'm a little guy. You want me to think about all of humanity? Hey, that's out of my league, right? You want me to think about even national policy? You want me to think like a Roosevelt? Hey, man, I'm a little guy.
Crazy.
I'm a little fish. Yeah, right. I'm a little fish in a big pond. Cusa says, hell no, you are a god if you choose to be. Not a god in the sense of Zeus. You are capable of knowing better and better God's mind, of knowing better and better and better how to do good. And that's an extremely controversial idea. It's outrageous compared to what comes before. Let me bring it to a conclusion by saying this. Imagine that what Modi is saying. He gave a speech. It's located in this EIR. Read the EIR. It goes through all of the speeches from the BRICS conference that we were able to record on this. He says, for the first time, the BRICS conference, the BRICS organization, this summit is on the basis of future potential, not on already existing potential. Aristotle says the only way you know anything is from stuff that already happened. Not on the basis of already existing potential. Modi says this is about future potential. This is about what are my young people going to do? What are my recruits going to do for the future of humanity? And in that sense, it comes entirely from this kind of conception that says, I mean, imagine a concept of a world without war, like we had at this conference. A world without war is a world where we defeat empire. We defeat a system of treating people like slaves, where you take people and you lift them up and you say, you too can conceive of yourself like this. How has that been destroyed in this country? Why is it so hard in this country? Who tried to do this kind of thing? Who decided, I'm going to do good and that's what I'm going to do because that's what I was made to do? John Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy was prepared to do that. And so the empire killed them so that people would abandon this. And then people get, they get apathetic and they get demoralized. And now you are responsible for going out to these people and saying, forget it. The rest of the world has figured this kind of thing out. When are you going to listen to LaRouche? We had a polemic years ago, long before I was ever a member of the organization. Are you a man or are you a beast? What are you going to do? What are you going to do about the fact that today, a billion people don't have electricity? Can you imagine what it's like to have, that we live in a modern society and we don't allow a billion people to have electricity?
People in Detroit have had their water cut off, and I've had my relatives who haven't had their water cut off in Detroit say, well, they don't pay the bills out of luck.
Yeah, this is just
These are fellow Detroiters.
Yeah, this is the callousness that's been imposed upon us. The only thing that can change it is this concept. It's only if you really think this way, and okay, I'm done. So I want to finish by returning to what I began with. Come on, one more, there we go. We must see ourselves as individuals, as potentially the embodiments of reason, as imago Dei. We must look into the faces of people around the world and see not different races, or this or that distinction, but see in those faces, in those eyes, another human being who is also imago Dei, who has that potential within them, and seek to raise that potential within them, or to create the circumstances in which the ideas of doing good are presented more clearly to the individual, and in which the opportunities for doing that good are more freely provided. If we do that, we are participating in creation. We are of value to mankind as individuals, beyond all doubt. In this best of possible worlds, let evil prompt us not merely to deny evil, which we must do, but let us be prompted by evil, as Schiller described the principle of tragedy. The tragedy of evil must be attacked, recognized, feared, and hated to such a degree that we are willing to do good, finally, to supplant the evil. I think this is it. This is the most moving conception, and it is the only thing that's going to change things. If you want to know why the Congress is going to stay in session, it's because of this. It's not because of some machinations. It's not because of some guy in a back room who decides to make a deal. It's because history is moved by these ideas. So, thank you. I'll end there.
For the toilet for the whole neighborhood was a huge dump heap with a platform standing over it, and a hole in the platform. It's worse than an outhouse, if you can imagine. And this kid fell into it. It's like so much feces, it's unimaginable.
And this is like right into the Ganges River, or wherever else. And so you have terrible diseases. So even kids who do get food, they're malnourished because of the diseases that they have, or parasites, all types of things. Now, the other thing it goes to is the question of the caste system. Because you have going back a system, generations upon generation, that was really massively reinforced by the British in their occupation and their domination of India, that says that, you have some people who are very high and some people who are very low, and the people at the bottom are called the untouchables, and they're responsible for sanitation and garbage collection. And that's their hereditary job. Like generation after generation, that's that's your line in life. So in other words, they're treated like slaves. They're treated like subhumans.
Right.
Okay, this is a huge problem in India. It signifies something that is terribly awry in their society. That is just, same evil as slavery in the United States or elsewhere in the world. And this has changed somewhat. That there used to be laws that said that if you were an untouchable, you couldn't marry someone in another caste. You couldn't even eat with someone in another caste. Other laws, you couldn't ride a bicycle through town. It was illegal for an untouchable to do this. And think about the human element of it too, because if you're an untouchable and you're cast into this situation where you grow up in the worst slums in India, in the worst conditions, and you're a garbage collector, or you're a janitor in these, whatever it needs to be done with this terrible situation with the open defecation, then you smell. You're covered in grime for your whole life. You're covered in disease and disgusting things. And how could you possibly see yourself as a human being? You would feel like a beast. You would feel like there's nothing in my life other than just trying to get by. Well, what about your children having a better life? You couldn't have any hope for that, because they're one of your caste. And then Modi walks in 2014, and he says, we're going to build modern sanitation, and we're going to give everyone the right to see themselves as worthy of a toilet. I find it deeply poignant. I think it goes straight to this question of what is a human being who is also imago Dei, who has that potential within them, and seek to raise that potential within them, or to create the circumstances in which the ideas of doing good are presented more clearly to the individual, and in which the opportunities for doing that good are more freely provided. If we do that, we are participating in creation. We are of value to mankind as individuals beyond all doubt. So again, in this best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz described it, let evil prompt us not merely to deny evil, which we must do, we must denounce it as well as denying it, but let us be prompted by evil, as Schiller described the principle of tragedy. The tragedy of evil must be attacked, recognized, feared, and hated to such a degree that we are willing to do good finally to supplant the evil. This gets to, Scott's major point, defiance. Most people don't understand the idea of evil. They don't understand the classical conception of what evil really is. So how are you going to understand that Obama is the tool of evil? That he's an evil shithead, right? If you don't understand this, you have to actually hate the evil that he represents. And this has nothing to do with party politics. It doesn't have anything to do with anything like that. It has to do with what it means to be human. So please keep this in mind, because this is my point. This is what I think we should be thinking on. This is what we should be focused on. This is what has real power. Now, let me give you an example. This is a story about Brunelleschi, who famously built the dome at Florence of the Santa Maria del Fiore, right, the beautiful Duomo. He supposedly, he was friends with Donatello, the great sculptor. And supposedly Donatello made this sculpture of the crucifix. And Brunelleschi came in, and he saw, and he looked at Donatello's work, and he said, "You've put a plowsman on the cross. This is too rough. This isn't beautiful enough. This doesn't get it. And so Brunelleschi went and he made his own. And when Donatello walked in to see Brunelleschi's, he was carrying, this is the folk story, he was carrying eggs and meat and bread for lunch or something like this. And he walks in, and as soon as he sees Brunelleschi's Christ, he drops his apron out of shock, and everything falls on the floor. Because he's so struck by the beauty of it. And I think you can see, I know it's difficult since it's not huge, but even from a distance you can see what I'm talking about. And I want to, because he has a faith in the people, and especially the young people, that they're going to have within them well up all of a sudden a pride, a dignity that had been taken away from them many generations ago. And I just make a further point on this. They could have done this in 1960. They could have done this earlier. I mean, another point Eli was making, he's not here today, but is that, plumbing was invented thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. This is not something new. It was invented even thousands of years before the Romans. We got a lot of credit for it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just want you to keep that in mind, because therefore, here's what my class is about today. The discussion that I want to have is about Nicholas of Cusa from the Renaissance and what he did to create the Renaissance, which is based entirely on an idea of man, a new concept of man. And his ideas about what does it mean to be human are what created all of the great breakthroughs in statecraft, all of the great breakthroughs in science, all of the great breakthroughs in culture. And I'm going to counterpose this to what you get from the other side. So I hope that I can provide a really good contrast for you between what our enemy is saying and has been saying for thousands of years and what people who have this idea of, real truthful idea of man believe. Okay, so this is a little bit, if you don't mind, I'm just going to move a little bit closer. Is that okay with you?
That's okay.
Okay. All right, so it's going to be a little bit hard to see, but we'll do our best. If you'd like to move up closer, then that's one thing to do too. Okay.
It's better, yeah, I can see it.
You see? All right. You got it, Giselle?
What?
Want to switch?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, this is from 1993. LaRouche was in jail. He was in jail as a political prisoner. And he gave the keynote address to an international conference that we had in 1993, which he recorded from his jail cell. All right? And I found it to be very striking, different from a lot of other things that LaRouche has written or said, spoken. This is the concluding two paragraphs, two ideas. We must see ourselves as individuals, as potentially the embodiment of reason, as imago Dei, in Latin, in the image of God. We must look into the faces of people around the world and see not different races, or this or that distinction, but see in those faces, in those eyes, another human being. I really, let me just begin by pointing out what Scott started with, which is the idea of two systems. Because that's what I'm going to talk about today. But you got to get the basic concept that it's not what you think moves history is not what moves history. But I don't mean you personally. I mean what most people think moves history is not what moves history. Most people, we were talking about this in the car, most people don't think that ideas are real. They don't think that ideas move history. They think that you're foolish. It's almost, you're naive if you think that ideas move history. You're an idealist. How pathetic, This is nonsense. It's insane. What's driving these two systems that Scott was developing is a concept of mankind. And let me give you an example on this. I've been telling everyone about this. I think you should tell everyone about this. I think it's fascinating. Prime Minister Modi, right? So I wish I remember the percentage. Do you guys remember what is the percentage of people under the age of 28 in that country? It's humongous. I think it's like 50%.
Yeah, 40-something percent.
40-something, between 40 and 50% of the 1.4 billion people in India are my age and under. I turned 28 this year, right? So that is astonishing. And remember that Modi was elected with 530 million people voting in the election. I mean, first of all, that's a great rate of participation. I mean, I don't even know how many eligible voters there are in India, but that's got to be an incredible rate of participation. Meanwhile, what do we average in the United States for presidential elections? I don't even know. It's abysmal. I won't even hazard a guess. Yeah. Anyway, so the point is, okay, so he's got this massive youth operation. His whole country is a youth movement. And he's recruiting people to think of themselves as creative individuals. Which I took a trip to Hyde Park for the 4th of July. I went with the Greenspans. I had a really fantastic time. Saw a few other people. And I had never been to the Franklin Roosevelt Museum. I really urge everyone to go. It's a beautiful thing, and they've actually renovated it recently. But the thing that struck me most was the letters that are written to Roosevelt, and they have hundreds of these letters all up and down the museum. And these are people who write to him, or they write to Eleanor, or they write, they're writing after his death, or they're writing at the beginning of his presidency. And what's clear is that they have a different kind of confidence in themselves because of what he's doing as president. So they're moved by the fact that he's, one of the letters as you walk in the door says something like, you made the president real, as opposed to some far-off person in a building somewhere in Washington, D.C. You made the president a real part of my life. Another person says about the fireside chats, you came into my home and you turned my home into a church. And you were the priest and the radio was the pulpit and my family and I were the parishioners. And I think this really speaks to the concept. It's not some kind of like hero worship. It's not just sort of like veneration of some great man. What it is you uplifted me. Now I can see myself as a human being. And you can imagine how difficult this would be. Imagine that, I mean, people are going through this right now, right, in the United States. But imagine going through the Great Depression where your identity is you're a worker, you're a laborer, and you provide for your family. And it's touch and go, because Social Security doesn't exist yet. So anyone who's older, you've got to take care of them, right? Or they must have, at least they have to put aside some money somehow. You've got, hi Giselle. You got people all over who all of a sudden, within 2 years, between 29 and 31, the unemployment rate goes from something like 6, 7, or 8% to 25% in 2 years. So massively, people are losing their jobs, they're losing their identity, right? And Roosevelt comes in and he treats the people like human beings. And the thing that I got most out of this trip, this visit to this museum, was that he actually, the reason he was such a powerful leader was because he believed in the power of the American people. And he committed himself to giving them the self-confidence to see themselves as people who could change history and create a future. So here's my point on Modi, is that Modi, one of the things that he's done that is most stunning is that he has, he's made a pledge. He's created a program to build 800 million toilets. And you can imagine the sewer systems that have to be built, the water systems and so forth, if you're going to build 800 million toilets in the next 5 years. Because in 2019 is the 150th anniversary of Mohandas Gandhi's birth, okay? So 800 million toilets. Why is this so important? Has any,
You know why it's important? Did you see that movie?
I was just gonna say
years
that.
ago? Those, I mean,
Slumdog Millionaire?
Right.
Does anyone remember this? It won an Oscar?
It was,
Okay.
that was, the dumb heap